35 minutes, all right. So I thought quite a bit about what to talk to you about, and so I decided not to talk too much about methodology. I'll talk about methodology a little bit more tomorrow to the people who need it more at the University of Toronto. So I'm going to try to sell sociology and motivation. In fact, so what I'm going to try to say, convince you, is that not only is the need of medicine so large for you that you must get more involved in helping patients, but I'm going to try to convince you that you actually can help patients today, and I'll try to do it with examples. So, Marja, I'm going to count on you on giving me a 10-minute warning and a 5-minute. A 5. All right, thank you. All right. So, everybody knows about this paper. The take-home about this paper, in which we Google diagnosed retinopathy better than ophthalmologists, was the only contribution of doctors to this was that they were the labeling function. That's it. The rest of it was done by Google. Although, since I wrote an accompanying editorial to it, I can tell you they needed a lot of editorial help. Anyway, so that's one. So one part of it is look what AI research can do. Has it been impactful yet? That's perhaps something that we should discuss. Here's another figure. This is when Air Malaysia disappeared into the Indian Ocean several years ago, there was 24/7 coverage of it in CNN, and as it should be, because the whole Airbus had disappeared with a plane load of passengers. Yet, here is not one plane load, but 700 plane loads of patients that disappeared without a trace, and the healthcare system was not aware of it. What is this? This is years on the x-axis. On the y-axis is the incidence of heart attacks. And there was a huge incidence of heart attacks at 2 of our major teaching hospitals in Boston, and we were unaware of it until I did the analysis with my colleagues, John Brownstein. And not only that, but not only did we not notice that we had lost 700 plane loads, but we actually had shot them down ourselves. It was the use of a drug called Vioxx, which was a very good anti-inflammatory agent that was really good for osteoarthritis, but because the drug company expanded, the marketing arm, expanded the indications to anybody, it was used very liberally, and it did have a heart attack-inducing risk. And so there was a huge cost in thousands of lives because of this. And yet, we've done this now for drugs that are in use and shown that we can intercept it in mid-flight, so to speak. But are healthcare institutions doing that now? No. When you go to the doctor, these drugs are being given to you, and someone's waiting for some big brother to, hopefully benevolent big brother, to find it. But no one is, and if we look just at our own hospitals, these signals are super large, and we would be able to see them. So let me give you an example of how things can be changed if you apply AI. This is not an application that I think you usually think about when you think about AI, but I'd like to make you think that way. Here's a story of a child who, by age 6, he had been fine at age 4. By age 6, he had stopped walking, stopped talking. Went to one doctor after another doctor after another doctor. No one knew what was going on. He was then referred to the Undiagnosed Disease Network, that I am privileged to be the principal investigator of the coordinating center at Harvard. But it's across 12 academic health centers, coast to coast, with also in mid-United States, where a patient gets referred, we architect it and we implement a system. All their genomic data, all their clinical data is hosted in the cloud, in the Amazon cloud. And so wherever the patient shows up, the data shows up with them, identified. We don't hold on to the patient. They can go to any academic health center to be seen by the right doctor. And so this patient was referred, and you just literally, if you're a patient, you just get your primary care doctor to write a letter, which you upload through the site at the website at Harvard, and that starts the process. And it turns out the child, we found, had a mutation in a gene called GDP cyclohydrolase 1. Now, you've never heard of it? Most of us had not heard of it. And here's an important point to realize. All of us in our 3 billion bases in our genome have dozens of mutations that if you looked in a textbook are disease-causing, like bad disease-causing. But they actually don't. And so the figuring out in a knowledge base and a database what are the variants that actually cause disease is a non-trivial process and is actually a classical, in my mind, few-shot machine learning problem. And so we have various groups working on this, and because of that, they were able to home in on that particular mutation. And that mutation causes neurotransmitters not to be produced enough. So this kid was basically running out of neurotransmitters because they were inefficiently made as his brain was growing. So he was given a cocktail of neurotransmitter precursors bypassing that enzymatic step. And within weeks, this child was walking and talking again. So much so that the parents who were no longer used to having a child that walked and talked had not created safety around the child because he didn't walk. And then he fell down the stairs and broke both legs, which ironically it was like a good news story because he was actually healthy and working again. And that was purely driven by this ability to have an ability to go across millions of variants, focus down on the 20 that matter, and with that 20 that seem to be disease-causing, and within those that are disease-causing, focus down on the one that actually causes disease in this patient. Because you don't have time to screw around and try serially all the possible hypotheses. And so, as a result, this infrastructure that didn't exist, that we built it in a year, including all the IRBs and all the governance. So, off our website recently, we've received almost 4,000 applications. We have seen almost 1,500 patients, and we've made new diagnoses for more than 350 patients. These are diagnoses never made before on these patients. And this could not happen without a machine learning approach to this diagnosis. And there are teams of data science at each of these hospitals that work with us. We also use social media to reach out with patient consent. The characteristics of the patients are stamped out onto a Twitter feed, and we get parents and doctors who recognize that they have a patient like this, and they come and get recruited by the Undiagnosed Disease Network. And I want to point out that in the New England Journal article that we wrote a few years ago, reflecting on the first 2 years of this network, it's now in its 8th year, even then, 30% of our patients who were referred to the network already had a genome or an exome done, but they had not been appropriately interpreted. And so getting the data interpretation right in the genomic era where we have high-dimensional data and we can triangulate it with other kinds of data like gene expression and the clinical data, I think is an active area where you can have huge impact. Just a slide to make the point that to show whether or not we chose the right mutation, we use gene editing, CRISPR, to knock in those mutations either into fruit flies or zebrafish to see if we get a phenotype out of those model organisms. Let me give you another story. This is about a friend of mine who's a professor at Harvard, a professor of pediatrics. And by the way, I should say one bit, although I did train in pediatrics, I'm now at the medical school, and there's a new department of biomedical informatics that I chair. And so this colleague of mine from back when I was training with him had a few years ago a child who at almost age 4 started having bleeding in his, coming out of his rectum and abdominal pain. He was scoped at Children's Hospital, found to have ulcerative colitis. And that's bad news, but he responded extremely well to a very mild anti-inflammatory agent called sulfasalazine. For 10 years, he did great. And then he flared, as often happens the case with puberty. And because I don't have much time, I'm going to run roughshod, but basically everything in the book, and this is not well-controlled medicine in Canada. This is American fee-for-service, plus having a professor who's in the system, his father, everything was tried. All the antibiotics, all the antimetabolites, all the different steroids. First generation monoclonal against something called TNF. Second generation against a white blood cell motility factor. Nothing worked. This child was pooping every hour with blood. He had been at Brookline High School. Now, if you're pooping every hour, you're wiped out. You're not sleeping, you're in pain, you don't go to school. They had a new dog, they weren't playing with the dog. And so my friend comes to me and says, Zach, he's now 5 weeks away from surgery. Can you do something? Can you do that crazy thing that you showed me a few years ago? So I'm going to tell you the crazy thing that we did a few years ago that we still haven't published because I'm a loser. But here's what it was. So this was done by, this is work that was done by a MIT postdoc. Well, he was at Bonnie Burger Group, Andy Beam, who was a postdoc with me, and Bryce, who was a postdoc with me. Now they've gone on to bigger, better things. But we had taken on the order of 60 patients, consecutive patients, who presented to Children's Hospital with abdominal pain. And they get scoped, and you take a biopsy of the tissue routinely, and you look under the microscope, and you decide, does this person have inflammatory bowel disease or not? And it's a microscopic pathological diagnosis. And we said, okay, we'll take that tissue, and we'll use a $200 test to measure, to create a vector. I like using the word vector in the Vector Institute. A vector of 20,000 elements, where each element is a real valued number corresponding to how much that gene is expressed. So there's genetic sequence, but the amount a gene is active, is being transcribed, is a numerical vector, a continuous numeric. And so for 20,000 genes, we have 20,000 elements in a vector. So each patient in this first two principal components of the principal component analysis is represented as a dot, and they're actually represented in the 20,000 PCs, but I'm just showing you here the first two PCs, which capture, looks like 52% of the variation. And not surprisingly, the kids who are normal, who are ruled out of inflammatory bowel disease, are shown in red, separate largely from those with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, shown in blue and green. That's not surprising because there's a lot of inflammatory cells in ulcerative colitis. It should change the gene expression program. But what we did then is ask ourselves the question, can we find existing drugs to move that patient's transcriptome, the gene activity, towards healthy? In other words, in that 20,000 element vector, the elements which are high relative to the healthy kids, can we push them down? And the ones that are low relative to the healthy kid, can we push them up high? There's a lot of assumptions in why that should work, and I'm glad to talk to you in the discussion period why that, what the weaknesses of the assumption and why it should work. But anyway, one of my former interns, Todd Golub, who's now at the Broad, had created a database called CMAP, which actually, across thousands of drugs, gave you the expression profile, and so allows us to actually do the linear algebra to figure out which gene best pushed individuals in the right direction. And it seemed to work well for well-known drugs that are used to treat ulcerative colitis. The vector of the drug from that database, purely in silico, suggested that things were being pushed in the right direction. So my friend asked me to do it for his kid. So we took the last biopsy, we quickly ran the analysis, and then Bryce comes to me and says, Zach, the top ranked drug is indigo, indirubin. I said, what the heck is indirubin? I've never learned it, so I did what I would hope you would do. I Googled it, and it tells me that indigo is a part of indigo. Indirubin is part of indigo, a purple bacterial metabolite, and that the Chinese call it qingdai. It's a supplement, and okay, fine. And so then the next thing is I look up qingdai and indigo in PubMed. And let me tell you, if for any given supplement, you will always find a paper that says it works for something. That's unfortunately true. And so when I found in this journal, which let me tell you is a third-rate journal for gastroenterology, and I apologize if it's your favorite journal, there is a trial where in Japan they were able to treat ulcerative colitis well. So I call up my friend and I say, sorry, we did the analysis, top-ranked drug is Indigo. And he says, and I thought he was going to say WTF. Instead, he said, Zach, that's really interesting. I said, why is it interesting? He says, because he's a smart father, Harvard-trained doctor, and he had been looking all over the world for how to treat his kid who had failed, who had not responded to all those therapies. And it was, at that point, 4 weeks away from surgery to remove his large intestine. And so because I reached around the world, and in Sheba Hospital in Israel, they routinely give Indigo to all the kids. But he says, I dismissed it, as I would have, because what are you going to give your kids some supplement? I mean, there was the Western medicine stuff, which we understand, and then this is supplement. And he said, but now, Zach, you're telling me that based on gene expression, this is the most highest ranked? Let's try it. And so where are we going to get Indigo from? You can get it over the counter, but the problem with supplements, you literally don't know what you're getting. You can either have anywhere from 0 to 100% of the active thing in any given preparation. So I said, why don't you have the Israelis FedEx it to you? So he did. And literally within 2 weeks, this kid who had been pooping every hour, it was not a complete cure, went to pooping 2 to 3 times a day, and energy came back, went to school. Because of the inflammation, he had not been growing, started popping up, and 3 years later, still is fine. And the point I want to make is 3 computer scientists did the whole pipeline to suggest a drug that no one else at Harvard was suggesting for this kid. It made a huge difference. I mean, the wife of this guy, who's a reporter, by the way, personally thanked these grad students because she was getting nothing but pressure to remove the colon of this kid, which, by the way, doesn't fix everything because sometimes a bit is left over that can be inflamed. And by the way, having a bag of poop hanging out at your front for even a few weeks is not a great thing, and surgery is dangerous. So think about that. Also think about the fact that, unfortunately, the green field is gone. We used to think that having information technology in hospitals would be a wonderful thing, and it could have been a wonderful thing. But unfortunately, things didn't work out. So one of our professors at Harvard, David Blumenthal, professor of policy, put into the Obama campaign a $50 billion plan to invest in electronic health record systems, which I thought was great, until what happened in 2009, because the economy had gone downhill. They said, we have to invest in existing, not future electronic health record systems. So that meant that all the existing systems, which, let me assure you, are state-of-the-art for 1980s, and I mean it, and I can go long about it, were then deployed across the United States. And these were not modular. It's all millions of lines of spaghetti code, no modularity. And in fact, so we wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine called No Small Change for the Health Information Economy. But the real message was, why can't, and we were explicit, why can't health IT be much more like the iPhone? You don't like your camera app, you get a different app. You don't like your to-do app, you download a different app and install it. There's no such substitutability in electronic health records. And we proposed that we should create an API to actually support such apps on top of the electronic health records. And by the way, this has been an incredible disaster. Even in Boston, one healthcare system, Partners, has spent over $2 billion on their electronic health record, and it still doesn't work great. And it's a major cause of burnout, and there's editorial after editorial written how these systems, which are terrible. I mean, the UIs are beyond unbelievably bad. Anyway, so we proposed this API, and someone took us very seriously, and I'll get to that. I just want to quickly get to a computer scientist by the name of Matt Might. Matt Might is a computer scientist, but he was a tenure-track computer scientist at University of Utah. And then his first kid was born. His kid was born. No one knew what was wrong with him. Had seizures, and then had delayed development. He himself pushed to have his kid, this is very early in the genomic era, have his kid sequenced, got it diagnosed, and there's a very nice New Yorker article, which I recommend to you, called One of a Kind, which was about his child and the journey they did. His child was the first ever human being to be diagnosed with a causative mutation for that disease in a gene called NGLY1. And so Matt has now become, through a whole process that I don't have time to tell you about, the director of the Precision Medicine Institute at University of Alabama. He's not an MD. He's had 6 weeks of high school biology, that's it. But he's now not a computer scientist at University of Alabama, and his computer science was mostly functional programming and functional programming languages and cybersecurity. He's the head of precision medicine there. And so, for example, let me tell you about a program that he does with his colleague Will Bird. It's old school AI working in 2019. It's old school logic programming, high-speed automated reasoning. These are his slides. So either if you like them, give him credit. If you don't like them, give him credit. And superhuman-like deduction with clinical insight. And so it answers questions like, what inhibits X? What may treat X? And for example, if you have an overactive bladder, there's 145 treatments. Which one's the right one? If you have Fanconi's anemia, xylitol turns out is a good treatment. So how did he do this? Well, there were 21.9 million PubMed papers were read, rather. They were parsed old school, I should say. And then they were tagged, whether it described a gene or a drug, and the label between them was also parsed. So, for example, Prevacid inhibits NGAs. And so he just created a logic programming environment, essentially the same kind of inference, the backward inference chaining that you see in Prolog, for example, to allow you to see potential causal links between a drug, a disease, and symptoms. And so these are the kinds of inferences that his system does. And so it doesn't tell you the right answer, but it gives you a list of potential drugs, given the fact that the gene causes disease, the disease increases the gene activity, the drug decreases gene activity, maybe the drug may treat the disease. It's that simple. And so he's done that for many, many, many diseases. So these are students of his, many of which don't have PhDs, who are actually running patient cases, undergraduates running patient cases that have solved case after case after case. So for example, Jordan dealt with a case of intractable cyclic vomiting. This woman, 19-year-old, had multiple episodes of vomiting, was down to 78 pounds. She had tried all known treatments. So again, he went through all the papers, and they came up with, at the bottom of a very long tail, nasally inhaled isopropyl alcohol. And she tried that, and she had 8 months without vomiting, back up to 125 pounds, and that's her getting married. So my point is, this is not a doctor story. This is computer scientists giving answers to treat individual patients. I also want to make sure we understand that in this pretty picture called La Marseillaise, there is a dirty underbelly, and we have to be aware of it in our situation. We have to, if we're going to take on patients as not only our cause, but our advocates to make ML applied, we have to show that the ML community is on the patient side. And Google has done a bunch of unforced errors recently that I don't want to get into in detail, but I'm glad to explain to you, which have just been really unforced errors, and a rookie medical informatics student would not make these errors that are just callous disregard for privacy and for due process in the handling of patient data. And so back with my thesis advisor, Mojde's thesis advisor, I wrote a manifesto back in 1994 called the Guardian Angel Manifesto, where we said that patients should be put in control of their own data and have agents looking over them. This is so long ago that we actually had a 2-letter domain, GA, so ga.org. And I'm just going to move past this. We created the API that we hinted at, and we implemented it because we got $10 million from the government. And this is where I'm going to conclude mostly. It's better to be lucky than smart. We didn't implement our API on top of multiple electronic health records, but one individual at Duke had implemented our API to get data out of the record for doctors on top of the Epic EHR, and he ended up being recruited by Apple. And because of that, Apple now has this is now out of date, and it's actually doubled since January. It's now 340 hospitals in the United States. If you own an Apple iPhone, you can get all your data dumped into your iOS system, or into the cloud backing of it, that you control across 340 hospitals, and they're estimating that within 2 years they'll get to 1,400 hospitals. That's millions of patients who have access. So if I were you and I wanted to help patients, this is a great platform to do so, because with patients' assent and consent, you have now access to health data that's actionable. It's not just Fitbit data, which is nice, but it's your HDL, it's your cancer diagnosis, it's there. And so I wrote an article in Science in 2007 about how we could actually have such an ecosystem. And again, because I don't want Marjorie to be mad at me, I'm not going to dwell there. And here is my closing slide. So what is this weird thing? Is it a heartbeat? No, it's weight. It's my mother's weight. So unfortunately, my mom passed, but several years ago, in her late 80s, she had been hospitalized twice for heart failure, and I couldn't have her do it again. So the second time she came from the hospital, I put an electronic scale from Fitbit in her home and had her weigh herself every day, even though I knew there were many studies that showed this does not help with heart failure. But I had to make it work because I had no alternative. And I did make it work. She had before we did this, she had huge legs filled with water. And what I would do is I'd look on the line on the web, and I jokingly refer this to my AI program, because I had one rule, which is if weight goes up by 1 pound 2 consecutive days, give her an extra oral pill of Lasix, which, by the way, scares the hell out of adult doctors when I tell them I did this, because I'm trained as a pediatric endocrinologist. But I did that because nothing else was working. And her legs went back to normal, and she didn't have to go back to the hospital for heart failure for years afterwards. And the point I want to make here is it was not just my AI program that did it. It's the fact that she trusted me, that I was a known factor. I made sure that I communicated with her doctors. I took care of the process automation. I also looked out for anomalies. So for example, my mother's weight started going down, and it turned out I was being like every other doctor. I wasn't listening carefully to the patient, my mom, and she was telling me that she was peeing up at night, and I should have realized that meant probably she was developing diabetes. So I immediately put her on metformin, and this went away. And so we have to engage with the healthcare system and figure out how. And I know the healthcare system is very unfriendly to us as quants, but there are ways, and there are people who are pushing the envelope. And I can tell you, the medical students I teach at Harvard Medical School, at least a third of them see this fully as their future. So in closing, I just want to put an advertisement out. If you're working in the area of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and you want to meet your fellow methodologists, but also the problem stakeholders, such as the payers of healthcare, such as doctors who are implementing systems, such as regulators, and even editors from the New England Journal of Medicine, come and join us in Bermuda. Sail.health is the URL. And for the young people, we have travel fellowships. Thank you very much.
All right, so we now have time for 15 minutes of questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand and back to Kohane.
Yep. So engage with me. It doesn't have to be a question, could be a challenge, a skepticism, a how-to.
I think the Apple EMR record is really interesting.
Yep.
Obviously, I'm a physician. My concern is the reach of big technology companies to healthcare patient data and our skepticism of whether or not they're going to be honest of not looking around the corner so that they can develop new technologies with their competitors if they have 2 million healthcare records with enough sample size to do something significant.
Right. I think that's completely a legitimate concern. And I don't know if this is sufficient reassurance or not. So what were the unforced errors? So Google did a secret deal with, secret until it was about to be announced by the Wall Street Journal. So then they blogged it, that they had this deal with Ascension Health. Now, part of it is completely innocuous, which is providing cloud services. No one has any issue with that. Providing G Suite. But what they were doing was, also there was a third rubric that you could drive a truck through, which was all sorts of analytics, where it was unclear who was going to benefit from these analytics. And it didn't have to be that way, because I can tell you they made a deal with the Mayo Institute, and the Mayo was smart. They said, we want the G Suite, we want the Google Cloud, but everything that we do will be jointly with us. You can't just have your nerds go off and look at it. And that's a difference between maintaining trust between the people that the patients trust and some third party that you don't know. And so that was very much an unforced error. Recently in W3C, they just refused a standard that everybody else had agreed to basically create sandboxes per user interactor. So you could create private sandboxes with all the people that you work with and control who gets to see what. They were against that. So that's not good. So Apple has turned this into a feature because they see that people are worried about Google and Facebook. And so right now, again, things could change, but right now it's not only de facto what they're really doing, that they don't touch that data without patients giving them explicit access to it through their iPhone, but they've turned it into a marketing campaign. That they're basically saying, you can look at it, it's not that subtle, that unlike everybody else, they're not grinding the data and testing whatever hypotheses they want. So I think that's the right model. Now, could money distort it in the future? Maybe, but at least it's the right model today. And they've written contracts such it'll be very hard for them to undo that. So there's actually some momentum. And so I actually have, today at least, a high degree of confidence that if I want to do a heart health risk assessor or a depression predictor using the data, and by the way, I've looked at my own data coming out of the Boston hospitals that uses that same API that we developed, and it looks better than on any, it's clearer than on any EHR. They actually made it user-friendly, where the EHR. So I think your concerns are on target. For the moment, I think Apple's distinguishing itself by being very, very fastidious in creating a patient-controlled model. Back in the back.
I have a question regarding sort of deployment.
Yes.
In 2004, I was working on building EHRs using EHR7, and people were very, very optimistic of how long it would take
Right.
for the entire healthcare system to be on it. So how do we learn from that process that it will take multiple decades and try to accelerate it so that it can actually benefit a larger number of people?
So that was very puzzling to me too, because people told me HL7 2.3 was a useful interoperability standard. But in fact, it wasn't. In fact, what it really was a barrier, because it was written very specifically. In order to be compliant with it and to be certified, you had to have a team of engineers just working on compliance. But de facto, it did not mean that you could actually transmit data from any one group, from one system to the other. And so that's why in this New England Journal article, we actually specifically called for what substitutability, the ability to just plug in a new app and use that data, just again as you'd use a new camera app. But in order to make that happen, we had to take an existing growing standard called FHIR and have a implementation guide that was very, very focused so that you'd get the same results no matter which EHR vendor used. And we actually sat with the with the 7 top EHR vendors, and 6 of them implemented the full stack, not only on their reference implementations, but in the field. And so it's because of that. So we did that legwork, and Apple appropriately, Ricky Bloomberg was the guy who was at Duke, took advantage of that and ran with it. And I have to say, this has been an annoying feature of my career, is that I've always wanted to focus on the machine learning part, and I have, but I get distracted often by having to do the infrastructure to do it right. It's not complicated, but so many people lie and use interoperability to actually obfuscate and prevent interoperability that I just had to put my foot down, and I'm very pleased that, I consider it one of my big impacts that something that we specified and implemented is now being used nationwide. So I'm more optimistic because Apple had to make sure that these things map to the right things in their own iOS ecosystem. So it's not perfect, but you could write a decision support app and it would not be that complicated. Yes?
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was wondering if you could say something about how people should present their results to health professionals. Because I'm a PhD and I work in a hospital, and I see people come in with these talks about how AI is going to solve the future, and they show their nice ROC curves with 99% AURC.
Right, and their business plan curves like this.
Exactly.
Right.
It's 99% accurate.
Yeah.
And then, a few years later, my colleagues are like, why didn't that thing work, right?
Right.
So how does one present results to medical professionals?
So again, I hate to do this because I keep referring to the same person. So Marja's thesis advisor and mine, PhD in computer science from Caltech, when he started a group at MIT, within 2 years, he had read most of the big books of medicine. He made himself smart about medicine. But he stayed a computer scientist, and he stayed a rational computer scientist. So he has a sterling reputation among doctors as being level-headed and knowing what's good and what's not. And so, if we had looked carefully, we would know about overfitting, we'd know about data set shift, we'd know about bias. All these things were knowable. And if you went and talked to your doctor friends in that way, you'd develop actually a reputation for being a quality colleague rather than a hypester. And I think the hypesters have done us damage. I asked Marja to introduce me as having done my PhD during the second hype wave of AI because I saw what happened when we did not meet expectations. There was 15 years where it was embarrassing and it's not smart for me to say that my PhD was in the domain of AI because it had left such a bad taste in so many people's mouths. So first of all, you have to find the right partners. And there are the smart doctors know that medicine is broken. And they do recognize that it is, at its heart, a data processing, information processing, knowledge processing discipline. Data comes from the patient. The doctor processes it. They use external knowledge if they've been a good doctor and kept it up to date. And then they put out a decision procedure that either results in medications or surgery done. It's just an information transaction. And if you understood medicine like that, it would be very, very different. And it's the way I do understand it and the way our department is. Oh, here's the thing. So come to Boston, Harvard Medical School, Department of Biomedical Informatics. I told you our department is mostly not MDs, but we really think we can revolutionize medicine. Sorry, Marja. But I just do think that being sober and thinking about it, doing trials, just as we would do for a drug, is the right way to go. And I've talked to editors of New England Journal and of JAMA, and although they will still continue to publish AI pieces, they're really, really looking now for the prospectively controlled trials to show the impact this has on healthcare. Now that's hard, but it's what all of us should want in order to prove that this actually impacts. And so find young doctors who are just out of their fellowship, who understand how medicine is broken, and run with them. I think it's quite doable. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering what role that governments could play
Yes?
Public health environment. So I'd like to know what would government look like.
So, right. So there are a couple things. By the way, when the eye retinopathy paper came out in JAMA, I called up my slightly annoying cousin in Montreal, who's an ophthalmologist, and I said, guess what? We can now read retinopathy without having a doctor. And I thought he was going to say, oh, that's not good, or no, it's not going to work. And his answer was, great. He said, I find it really boring to look at those pictures. I'd rather be in the operating room making more money doing surgery on patients. So this notion that we might be shifting jobs around is maybe a little naive, because this allows him to make more money. We've just commoditized something they did, and allows them to go to the more expensive things. So there's some unintended consequences which are not obvious. But to get to your point, it's hard to know what to wish for, because on the one hand, we would want the Food and Drug Administration to approve AI procedures as acceptable. And they actually have approved several programs, including one that is a retinopathy. But should we actually be worried about that? Because there's no concept there of data shift. What if the healthcare system shifts underneath us, as it does? Billing codes shift all the time. The usage of billing codes shifts. And that's because knowledge changes, but also the way doctors get paid changes. So doctors are smart. They'll do this adversarial attack, which is they'll change the billing code to codes, and they have whole departments whose only job is to do this adversarial attack. With my colleague Sam Finlayson, one of our MD PhD students, we wrote this article in Science about adversarial attacks. And everybody focused on the fact that we had talked about adversarial attacks on the images. But I think it's much more important that we're going to be doing the possibility of doing adversarial attacks on the billing part of the system, because that's where the money is, and that's where people put their efforts. And so I think the regulation is going to be key. So on the one hand, we want it to be permissive to let us experiment the system. On the other hand, it's also very predictable that if we just let everybody come in with a program that worked well on some population that doesn't have any commitment to updating with data shift, has some poorly understood population dependence that maybe doesn't work as well on African Americans. Do we want that to be that permissive? So that is the Wild West right now. And so it's not clear who has the smarts and the time and the people to have that conversation in a thoughtful way. I could imagine that Vector Institute is one of those places that could actually drive that conversation, because it needs to happen. And again, FDA is doing a million things and doesn't have a million people. And so you're right on, but I just gave you a few examples to recognize that no one's really minding the store right now. Yes?
Thanks very much, Roger. I have a couple questions. I'm going to ask you one, Bill, about tolerance for error. And I think this is a generic issue with AI, not necessarily just in medicine, but I'll ask you specifically about medicine.
Yeah.
Physicians are making judgment calls all the time.
Yep.
They make mistakes. They don't get it right very often.
That's on a good day. That's when they're not being perversely bad.
We want an ABC on a machine learning that's 99% or better.
Yep.
And I just wondered, like, if you could comment, we won't let automatic driving cars onto the road because they've been an accident. Well, I mean, there's 10,000 accidents every day. But the tolerance for a machine to make an error is much, much lower than our tolerance for people to make errors. And so if we're relying on diagnostics from machine learning, AI, what do you think the implications are for the tolerance for error and what that might do when they do misdiagnosis?
So what you're saying is mostly true, not quite true. My favorite example of it would be not quite true is MRIs. And it also CT scans, because it speaks to two things that medicine claims not to be tolerant of. One is errors. The other is black box. Well, guess what? Most doctors do not understand the Fourier transformations that are occurring inside the computer, inside the MRI or CT scan. And yet, they say, that's a picture, let's go surgery. And even if it doesn't look like that when they go in, So that black box, explainability around the MRI's procedure, never an issue. And it does make errors. And there are unidentified bright objects that sometimes are a real thing or sometimes are an artifact. So why is that? It's because it's actually really, really useful. It creates a superpower. And so I think the challenge is, can we make superpowers for doctors? I think that's what, if it's something just slightly better, I think they're going to focus, because it changes their practice. They were willing to take MRIs and CT scans in because it changed things. We were not going to cut you open. And so there are superpowers that we can do. And I think that, for instance, the dermatology applications, I think, are superpowers. And you don't have to be error-free. You just have to have a good yield. Because, by the way, at least in the United States, in fact, it's true in Canada too, they're getting paid every time they scoop out a lesion. And so if they scoop out a few benign lesions, that's okay too. They do that every day. But if you can increase the yield, they will be tolerant. So you have to find the applications where it makes a difference. I know it is unfair because doctors make so many mistakes and kill so many people but if you want to have adoption, we go first for the ones where we give a superpower. Like routinely we use AI, it's more like a decision tree in ECG, automated analyses that most doctors use. We used to have everything seen by cardiologists. Now it just gets read. So I think there are applications where there are superpowers, and I'm glad to give you examples of that.